Alright, what's going on, everybody? It's Alan Thomas, aka Shadow Assassins, and today I wanted to talk about, or rather, hopefully this doesn't turn into like a weird or controversial conversation. It shouldn't, but in any event, I wanted to talk about writing strong female characters as a guy writing a story. A lot of times, writing stories, as men, we sort of write with a focus on the male characters in our story, and considering a lot of times the fan base of a lot of our tales are sort of wrapped around the males in our story, we don't pay as much attention as we should to the female ones, which can be problematic when you're sort of writing the females with the same cliches that you see everywhere. And it also can make your stories, more particularly the female characters in your stories, rather annoying to females that may read it. Contrary to popular belief, even manga like shonen manga and whatnot, they still get read by females. Like, even though your story may be aimed at males, there's still women that may like it and want to read it as well. It's sort of annoying at times when you have women that read stories that men write and the characters are, I don't even want to just say weak, specifically cliched characters. Weak characters is sort of in and of itself a writing issue, but just writing cliches is an even bigger problem. So the 3 tips that I actually want to give personally, considering that I try my best when I'm writing stories to avoid a lot of these pitfalls, which I don't want to toot my own horn, and I'm sure someone would point me out if this was a contrary, but like, I feel like I write relatively memorable and uncliched female characters. I don't think that the females that I write in my stories can be boxed into a typical quote unquote stereotype of what you see a lot of men write the females as in their stories. And that's because I try to avoid, and tip number 1 that I actually have down here is to avoid sticking to cliches and the typical tropes that you find female characters written as in stories. And this is a thing that happens in video games, movies, television, all over the place. You always see, I'll put it this way. I remember in college where, I believe I was in college, where it was the first time of many that I heard the notion that to measure the strengths of the females in a particular body of work, analyze them based on 3 key things. What significance do they have to the story? Are their actions revolving around a man? And are they hypersexualized or basically damsels in distress? If your female characters all fall into one of these 3 stereotypes, God forbid you have females that actually embody all of them, then you have written a pretty weak and cliche female character, and you want to try your best to avoid that. That's not to say that if you have a female that's a damsel in distress, or if you have a female that is hypersexualized or anything, it's necessarily a bad thing. But that can't be every female character, or it can't be the only aspect to the character in your story, which is something that kind of happens a lot, especially with men that's writing about women in their novels, comics. Just for the purposes of this channel and this conversation, I'm just going to stick with manga, webcomics, and comics in general. But thinking about this specific character, like not pigeonhole, not sort of boxing in the character to specifically their gender, would probably help you into not doing these things. Because I guarantee you, if you just look at the character as a character, you wouldn't necessarily have this problem, which leads into my second bit of advice to sort of help to combat having weak female characters, and the first issue that I just mentioned, and that is writing the characters as the individual that they are and not necessarily writing them based upon their gender. Look at it like this, and this is only me as a guy who has written numerous stories with females in the stories that have, like I said, avoided a lot of these cliches and whatnot. Try this approach. If you're writing a story and you have a female character in the story, take the gender out of the equation for a second. Who is this character? What is this character doing? And how would these characters behave in these situations throughout your story? Thinking along those lines will better aid you in the character development and sort of the plotting around of that particular individual and character in the story, instead of thinking, okay, she's a female, so I have to have her doing this, or I have to make her this way, or anything like that. Want to sort of avoid doing stuff like that in the story. Just to give you a personal example, the character Kanzi that I have in Infinite Uppercut, and I understand that Infinite Uppercut is a comedy, but in my comic, she is a character who, don't get me wrong, one of her focuses in the story, or her ultimate goal in the story, is to get her revenge on the quote-unquote arcade guy in my comic. In theory, yes, it sounds like, okay, it's a character who is sort of revolving themselves around a male in the story, but it's not necessarily on the typical, oh, it's a romantic story or she's obsessed with this man type thing. It's like, no, there is other reasons why. Well, that's actually completely not related to the character, but there are other reasons why she wants to necessarily find this individual. And then that's not the basis of her character in general anyways. Kanzi as a character, not even looking at her as a female, she is a person in this story who has tremendous fighting abilities that nobody understands why she's able to fight as well as she does, or where her anger comes from, considering that 99 times out of 100 she's focused on playing video games. Like, she is a character that is hyper obsessed with video games. That's more of the bane of Kanzi as a character, as ridiculous as that sounds. So granted, that may not be the actual greatest character in the world. May not even necessarily be a strong character, but it's a lot more interesting than what you typically see a lot of guys write the females as in their stories, simply because it's not falling into the same traps and cliches that you see everywhere. It at least sounds different, and different is good. Like, I don't want to use like an actual mainstream example, but what immediately came to mind in having this conversation is Orihime in Bleach. Orihime doesn't really even, in my opinion, this is just me, if you disagree, please let me know in the comments below, but like, in my opinion, Orihime is pretty much, I don't want to outright say she's a useless character, but she's the damsel in distress so many times in Bleach. I don't know why. I don't even know why they even bother rescuing her sometimes in that story. Like, there's just no layers to her. When you compare Orihime to the other females in the story, like a Rukia or even a Yoruichi, like, she's an extremely weak character when placed up to some of the other females in the same story. Another one that immediately came to mind was Naruto when I think of Sakura. Sakura, who at the beginning of part 2 of Naruto actually had a lot of promise, but eventually resorted to the same weak damsel in distress like character, or the love interest type character in terms of where Sasuke is concerned, where she was pretty much spent the latter half of Naruto obsessed with Sasuke, outside of when she conveniently was needed to do medical jutsu. Her purpose in the story, considering that Sakura kind of was a main character, to me, she's extremely poorly written, and she falls into a lot of those cliche traps that I talked about earlier. In contrast to her mentor in the comics, which was Tsunade. Tsunade is a much stronger female character than Sakura. And it's not even that Tsunade doesn't even fall into the same sort of cliches and tropes, but those aren't the bane of her character. There are actual layers to Tsunade, and there's a little bit of depth there. Like her gambling addiction. Like, that's a nice little sort of monkey wrench that's thrown into the characterization of her that isn't, like I said, on Sakura at all. You just want to come up with ways to make the character unique and the individual unique, not necessarily looking at her solely as just a female and writing sort of the same old from there. An actual strong character that just came to mind, and this isn't necessarily comic related, but when you think about a character like Sigourney Weaver's character in Alien, she was badass in Alien, and the thing was, she had to be. I mean, in order to survive in that movie, she had to sort of take the bull by the horns and start to get aggressive and sort of lead in that movie. and she was a badass female, but it wasn't even like any forcible, like, oh, she's just this strong, empowered woman type thing. It was like, no, you saw the circumstances that were going on that made her have to take charge, and through the growth and the development of the character over time, she became a very strong female in that movie and was the main character, and like you were rooting for her. She's awesome, an awesomely written character. The last tip that I actually want to give here too, talk to women. Like a big problem, and age almost has nothing to do with it, because there's a lot of grown adult males in various different genres of entertainment that sort of write females this way. But like talking to women and sort of gauging their opinions on the characters that you write may help you a little bit in developing them. Using your own experiments, using your own experiences and interaction with females to try to get examples or gauge how to write your female characters, or simply like, I don't care if it's girlfriend, wife, sister, cousin, aunt, mom, whoever it is, to let them read over your story or take a look at your story or your characters and sort of give their own opinions just as feedback, just to see how your characters are coming across if you're ever in doubt of the strength of them. Because do realize and please believe, you will never know how many females may or may not read your stories at the end of the day, whether you're gearing your story towards women or not. So always just sort of keep that in mind. But those are my 2 cents for today. I would actually like to know what your thoughts on writing female characters are in the comments below, and specifically what your experiences or actual practices are writing your female characters. I would love to hear those as well. And any bits of advice that you may have to give the others would be nice, just as conversation in the comments. Obviously, as usual, like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Also hit the notification bell, because you'll never know that any of these videos ever come out without it. Thanks, YouTube. And you all have a good one, and I'm out.